Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
I believe we ended on verse 12 of chapter 8 without having done the Rashi, so let's remind ourselves what's happening in the verse, and we'll see. We might even get through a plague and a half today because Rashi is quiet, but that doesn't mean that you have to be. Rashi certainly is pretty quiet. Okay, verse 12 of chapter 8. Vayomer Adonai al Moshe, Emor el Aharon, Netei ad matecha, dahach et afar haaretz, vayalachinim b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. So, after Pharaoh's heart was hardened after the end of the frogs, God said to Moses, say to Aaron, extend your staff, smite the dust of the earth, or as we discussed, it may not mean like dust, but more like the ground of the earth. And there will be, or it will become, right? We discussed what the subject of the word haya is. Maybe the avar will become lice. We discussed that the verb to be with a preposition lamed, can become the word become. B'chol eretz Mitzrayim, throughout the entire land of Egypt. Okay, that's where we ended. We read that verse, and we did not do the Rashis on it yet. Does anybody have any lingering questions or comments on the verse before we look at the Rashi? Joanna?
Not on this verse, but I wanted to go back for a second because the timing of our class was very fortuitous in that a few days after our last class, I found myself in Shul reciting Hallel, and I had like an epiphany in the midst of Hallel that we spent a lot of time discussing what Revach is, but we did not discuss its opposite or what it's not. And in Hallel, we say min hametzar, from the narrow place. And what's the opposite of being in the narrow place? Anani vamerchavya, to be in the expanse, and to be in the expanse with God's grace, with God's help. And we see that usage also again in Megillat Esther, when Mordechai, though we don't have the tsar there, the Jewish people are in Tsuris, they're in tsar, they're in a narrow place. And Mordechai says to Esther, if you're quiet in this moment, Revach is going to come from another place. So I was thinking how we were discussing at the end of the plague, we see the absence of God, but maybe this is a hint that God is in the Revach, and that this Revach too was part of the plan.
Yeah, and I can't tell if you're saying this implicitly or explicitly. Min ha-metzar karatiyah, the narrow place, metzar, that's Mitzrayim. Right?
Exactly.
Egypt, right. So that what Joanna's picking up is very beautiful. That if you look back on verse 11, when it said that Pharaoh was experiencing harvacha, and we talked about this sense of relief or expansion, and in Hallel, the root harvacha is contrasted with the root metzar, which is the word that we get Egypt from, right? So I never picked up on that, and that's lovely. And it's, sure, Pharaoh was experiencing harvacha, but everyone else under his control was experiencing Mitzrayim underneath him. Yeah, nice. Thank you for that, Joanna. Anything else in the verse before we look at the Rashi? Anyone? Okay, let's look at the Rashi. Alan, do you want to read the Rashi? I feel like you haven't read in a while.
Sure.
You know, microphone. And as Alan reads this Rashi, remember, well, no, I won't say that. Just read the Rashi.
Amar el Aharon, lo haya ha'afar, lo haya afar bir'e lil shot a mish.
I'm not sure where you're reading, Alan.
Wait. Oh, okay. Probably got a wrong spot. Okay. Amar el Aharon, lo haya afar kedai lil kot al yedei Moshe.
Lefi?
Lefi shahagen alav keshaharag et hamitzveh vayit mighu bechol.
Okay. So,
Velakach al yedei Aharon.
okay. So let's break it down. So on the phrase that Amor al Aharon, clearly what Rashi's picking up on is that Moshe is being told by God to do something and not to do something. What's he being told to do? What's he being told not to do?
He's told that he's not going to be the one to start the plague.
Right. He's being told, don't have you extend your rod and smite the dust, but rather have Aharon do it. And Rashi wants to understand why that is. So,
Yeah.
Lo haya hafar kedai lil kot al yedei Moshe. What does that mean?
The dust or the ground or soil, though it wasn't kedai, it wasn't worthwhile, it shouldn't be done by Moses.
Right. Kedai here, it's different than the way we would use the word kedai in modern Hebrew. Here it means worthy or appropriate or deserving, right?
Okay.
The dust did not deserve, I mean, it didn't deserve the pain, as it were, right? To anthropomorphize the dust, to be smitten, lilkot. Lilkot looks like a active word, but it really means to be passive. Lilkot al yedei Moshe, by Moshe's hands. Why? Keep going, Lefi.
Lefi shaharag alav, because it shahagen alav, because like it protected him.
Because the earth protected him when
when he killed the Egyptian man and hit him in the sand.
Okay.
Oh,
so we got to this. I don't remember if Rashi brought this or we brought it from somewhere else, that when the first plague comes, and what's being smitten in the first plague? The Nile. The Nile turns into blood, but what's being smitten is the Nile. And either Rashi or someone else brings there, the reason why Aaron does that is that the Nile saved Moshe too. When did the Nile save Moshe? When he's a baby, right? So it's actually a very lovely lyrical read that as society is being demolished, there's still a concern for the feelings of natural, natural inanimate objects that were part of the story of making sure that Moshe would survive. And even though we unfortunately have to do this to the sand and we have to do this to the water in order to get the Egyptians, Moshe, like you can't smite the hand that feeds you, right? You were saved by the water, you were saved by the sand. Let Aaron do that, right? And so just finish it off. Velaka.
Therefore, it was stricken by Aaron.
Right. So Aaron did it and not Moshe, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of a sweet, fantastical, but a sweet idea that we're doing something to protect the feelings. It's unclear if it's protecting the feelings of the sand and the water or protecting Moshe's feelings from having to, bring his hand down with God's wrath on the matrices that protected him in two different stages of his life. I see Joanna's hand, then I see Norm's hand. While Joanna's speaking, Norm, get a microphone close to you.
The end of your comment was essentially what I was going to say. Is it about the water and the dust feelings, or Moshe's feelings about what had helped him and protected him? Yeah,
I mean, Midrash is not afraid to ascribe feelings to things, right? So it could be that the phrasing is very interesting. That it's the subject is the dust. The dust was not worthy, didn't deserve to be smitten by Moshe. Is the focus there on what the dust is going to experience, or is it just a way of saying, Moshe, you don't deserve to be the one who smites the dust? It's the way Rashi phrased it unclear. I forgot the exact language in the Midrashim in which he pulls it from. Yeah. Norm?
I would say that even if Rashi uses language that suggests it's the dust or the river, for that matter, being spared, it isn't, because they still get smited. So it's got Moshe's feelings that Moshe did not benefit from something and then harm it.
Yeah, right. The dust is still being smitten. Is it worse for the dust, as it were, if we stay in this magical place, to be smitten by the one that it had saved than it is to be smitten in general? Obviously, there's no answer to that question, and we're in some magical thinking. But whenever I come across this idea, I'm moved by it. I'm moved by it that as God seems to be willing to tear asunder the natural world and do what has to be done to free the Israelites, it's not a complete surrender of ethics and morals and feelings. And maybe that just makes us feel better about all of this yucky stuff that's happening to the Egyptians. But there's even an overlay of tenderness in this story of destruction.
It's kind of like covering the challah to spare its feelings.
Very nice.
When we're making kiddush on Shabbos or Yontif, but on Chol HaMoed, we pour the wine, don't bless it. We bless the bread, say leishev, and after we've eaten bread, we can drink all the wine we want.
Yeah, very, very nice, Norm. I see, and I see Barry. I'm looking like, what's her name? My God, terrifying. That woman over there.
Well, for anyone who didn't hear, I have those moments with my children too. What was their name? I'm just looking at Ibn Ezra, who also notes that Moses, that this was like a plague of the ground, of the earth, of a lower realm, and that Moses, he says that Moses brought on the plagues that were in the wind and the ones that were higher, and this was the dust. And so this one went to Aaron, who was of lower.
Let's look at that together. I'm going to put up on the screen. I don't know if people can see the screen from here. I'm just putting up Ibn Ezra. It's interesting because later on, we'll probably not get there today, Rashi will also give his own theory on the and we discussed this last week. Is there a meta order to these plagues? Is there a way to kind of track the progression from 1 to 10? Rashi gets to it later. Ibn Ezra says something here. Da ki al yad Aharon hayu hashalosh makod rishonot, that the first 3 plagues were handled or initiated by Aaron. V'haotot hayu b'shvalim. These signs, ot is a sign, were amongst the shvalim, the lower things. Kamosha pirashti lamala. So I guess Ibn Ezra said it earlier. Ki hashtayim hayu b'mayim. 2 are on water, right? The blood comes from the water. The water. Largely sheep afar haaretz, the 3rd from the low dust. Bahamakot shayu ayidei Moshe, and the other 7 that were initiated by Moses. B'mateh hayu be'elyonim. The ones that he initiated with his staff were in upper realms. Kemo shema'alato elyonam mimalat Aaron. It's a way of praising Moses of being on a higher plane. So Aaron, you can handle the low, dirty, like Nikayon plagues, and Moshe will handle the upper realms as God's upper fury is brought down. Kamo makat parad, like the hail, the arbet, and the locust. Sheharuach heviyam, it's the wind that brings them, and wind is considered a high power. Choshech sheyav avir, right? What is darkness? Darkening of the light. Gamakat hashkin ayado, oils that were done on his hand.
Your microphone is weird.
It's going in and out, huh? But you can hear me either way, right?
We can hear you, but I'm sure.
Those on Zoom, were you hearing me in and out, or are you hearing me okay?
It's breaking up.
Yeah, it's in and out.
When I was in rabbinical school, I had no idea how much of my work would be based on technology and batteries and cords and wires, and it's just unbelievable. It's like, okay, great. So thanks for pointing that out to us. Ibn Ezra then gives a different explanation than Moshe does than Rashi does as to why Moshe begins the plagues, not Aaron. Barry, get Barry a working mic. Here, I'll get mine's closest.
So going back again to why Aaron's doing this, not Moshe. The narrative structure. This is God's narrative structure. It's God's narrative structure that Moshe was going to be saved in the Teva on the river, and it's God's narrative structure that the person that he killed would be hidden in the sand, and so God basically is giving permission to have the water struck and have the dust struck, but not by Moshe.
Great, and without this, one of the things that this comment by Rashi does, whether or not we kind of lean into it and believe it, is it links the earlier narratives to this one, right? We're very far away from Moshe in a basket in the Nile. And then Rashi reminds us, no, we're not, right? And that all of what took place then set up this redemption, as if, as Barry said, the redemption had been put into motion the moment that Moshe gets into the basket, because even some of the imagery from that scene gets brought back here. Great. Okay, anything else in this verse before we look at the next one? Rebecca, send me that picture. I would love to have that picture. Okay. Let's read verse 13. Alan, you just got a half, so why don't you read this one?
I knew. V'yasu chen vayet Aharon et yado b'matehu v'yach et ha'afar ha'aretz v'tehi ha'kinam ba'adam uve'ma kol afar ha'aretz haya kinim b'chol eretz Mitzrayim.
Okay.
Okay. So Aaron stretched out his hand.
Well, first Vayasu chen.
And they did this.
And Alan, bring the microphone even closer to your mouth. Yeah.
Okay. Vayasu chen, and they did, and so it was.
Right. So it's interesting that it's a plural, right? Because God had been speaking to Moses and telling Moses to tell Aaron something, and then we're told, and they, Moses and Aaron, both accepted the command. Go ahead.
And Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff or his rod, and he hit the dust, and
pause right there. It just strikes me, haha, pun intended.
Yes.
That the verb vayachet hafar is the same verb that describes Moshe smiting the Egyptians back in that scene. So there's even an Rashi's reminding us that the earth protected, now the earth is being smitten, but even the smiting is a redundancy or an echo to that scene, because it was vayach, exact language. That chapter 3. Done. No, before that. Vayach et hamitzri, vayitmanenu bachol. So it's the actual same word. He smites the Egyptian and he hides him in sand. And now Aaron is smiting, same word, the dust instead of Moshe. Okay, keep going. Vatehi hakinam.
And there was lice. A lice. There was lice infestation. It says here, and that was on the man, on the people and on the beasts, and all of the dust of the land became lice, and it was throughout the land of Egypt.
Good. And the most interesting kind of word in the verse is this word hakinam, right? And it's interesting for what it doesn't say. It doesn't say vayehiyu kinim, and there were lice. It's this word hakinam, which seems to be built from the word from which we get kinim, but it's in a form that if you know how nouns operate and verbs operate, it doesn't really match. We made reference to this earlier, and we actually even looked a little bit at the Rashi on this, but it's a feminine, whatever it is a feminine word, because vatehi suggests a feminine, and it clearly has to do with lice, but we're not sure exactly how to parse it. Different translators read it differently, of course. I'll put up a few of them on here, so we'll look at that. This is for 12 or 13? 13. Okay, so let me share the screen, and we'll look at some translations, and then we'll hear if anyone else has any interesting ones in front of them. So, okay. This is the translation on the screen of Everett Fox. They did thus. Aharon stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the earth, and gnats were on man and beast. He's translated in English that describes the scene well. He doesn't really, I think, deal with the oddity of the word hakinam. First of all, he's going gnats rather than lice, whatever. But he's just saying the impact of these words is that the bugs were everywhere. That's Everett Fox. Let's check JPS. Oops. Come on, Wi-Fi.
Leonard, can you let Bubba in? Can you let...
How or where? if you go on to any verse, and then to the right, there's commentary, if you click translations, you'll see different translations, and you can choose the translation that you want. I don't know why this put me into the 8th chapter. What verse are we on? 13?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, JPS. Corin. And they did so, for Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and in beast. So again, turning the verb to be into a becoming as opposed to a just being. I would like to see JPS.
Saperstein says lice infestation was on man and beast.
Lice infestation. So Saperstein is impacted by Rashi. We'll look at Rashi in a second, suggesting that the word hakinam is not referencing the animals themselves, but the phenomenon. JPS. And they did so. Aaron held out his arm with a rod and struck the dust of the earth, and vermin came upon man and beast. I want to look at Kahana. And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with a staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there was vermin upon man. So all similar. Larry, do you have any interesting ones? Give him a microphone.
Alter has, and there were lice in man and in beast.
Okay, pretty standard. And Arya Kaplan?
Arya Kaplan changes it. He has, the lice appeared, attacking man and beast.
Okay.
I find, can I just comment? Of
course.
It's interesting that most of the commentators who use, including Alter, and I think one of the other ones you read also said in man,
yes.
Which is, to at least my sensibility, is kind of a weird thing to say. Because if there's lice in me, I'm thinking internal to me, not just on me.
Right.
So I don't understand why they felt the need to directly translate be, which is usually in, but as a preposition can be translated in a number of ways. It just seems to me to be wrong.
The wrong translation or the wrong rendering of that into English? The
wrong rendering.
Yeah.
Be in this case should not be in man.
Yeah.
It should be, right, should be on or
among,
something.
upon.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Okay. The be might make more sense with Rashi's rendering what hakinam means. So it's almost like you have to choose which one you're going to go. You're going to choose to be governed by what you think be should mean in this verse, or you're going to choose to be governed by what you think hakinam means and then make them match. Diane?
So I think you need to create an English word as opposed to, because there isn't any good way to express it in English. They were licified.
They were licified, a licification. Yes, exactly. Sometimes that actually does help, right? Leonard?
The microphone has arrived. According to my dictionary, the word is actually kinam. The ha is an article, and it's a collective noun meaning vermin or lices.
A single vermin noun?
Excuse me?
Like it's singular?
It's singular, but it's a collective noun.
Right. Let's see what Rashi says. Actually, look at the Onkelos for a second before we look at Rashi. So I think everyone who has a text has Onkelos, or do I pull that up? Not everyone does. Let me pull that up. All right, Onkelos. Well, we are learning that however beautiful it is out here, the Wi-Fi is not exactly as strong out here. Although it's allowing the video, but it's not allowing me to load pages as well. Okay, so I'm going to bring the Onkelos on the screen. So you have it side by side on the screen. Avadu chen, they did thus. Va'arem Aharon yat yadei. Aaron lifted the word laharim, like from Camp Ramah. He lifted his hand. Bechutrei, his stick. Umacha yat afra. He smote the dust, the ar of the land. V'havat kalmata ba'anasha. There was a kalmata. We'll deal with that in a second. Upon people, anasha, uvavira, and animals. And so he turns the word into this word kalmata. V'havat kalmata b'chol arad Mitzrayim. And there was a kalmata on the entire land. What's interesting about Onkelos, even before we define kalmata, is that he basically reads hakinam in the first half of the verse and kinim in the second half of the verse are the same thing. right? For us, it was like, we know what kinim are in the second half of the verse. That's the plural of lice. What we don't know is what hakinam means, right? Onkelos says, yeah, it means the same thing. They're both kalmata. And if you look at, oops, not that. Where's that? Hold on. Where's, I just lost everything. Where's my Zoom? Okay, let me pull up the Jastro on the word kalmata. So if you look up Jastro, the word kalmata with a kuf, it says look at it under a kaf. Sometimes the kaf and the kuf are interchangeable. And where's kalmata? Okay, here. So it's a collective noun, Leonard, a dialectic adaptation of the Hebrew kinam. So somehow the word kinam, which itself is from kina, which means life, got transmuted into Aramaic to kalam. The nun became a lamed, and then the kaf became a kuf. So kalmata is actually the word kinim. Etymologically, just went through a metamorphosis. So it's not even as much of a translation into Aramaic, rather than a rendering of what the word became. And it means a nesting of vermin. Okay, so let's look at the Rashi. And then, Joanna, do you want to speak before the Rashi or after?
Just a thought on the word kinam. As we're saying that word, I'm thinking about yom v'layl and the difference between that and yomam v'layla. And I can't fully explain grammatically why the yom would get the final mem as a suffix and lila gets a hey. But I was taught once that it's the difference between saying day and night and daytime and nighttime. So if yomam is daytime, maybe kinam is kinim time.
Yeah. Again, the phenomenon of the kinim rather than the specific noun referring to the animals. Stevie, and then we'll look at Rashi. We've already basically done Rashi out loud, but we'll look at him inside in a second. Oh, he needs a microphone. They need to ask for 10 microphones next time.
Yeah, just 2 points, some of which I said vocally, but not in the mic. That the bet, we also have at the beginning of the verse, the right, beyado, or mate beyadehu, right? I don't have the verse in front of me right now. Mm-hmm. But it's clear that it's right. It's the hand with the staff, right? So it like the bet seems to be backwards. You would expect it to be the other way, so the bet clearly doesn't have to mean inside, but rather could be with and stuff like Larry said. But then also about these collective nouns we had earlier, right? Svardeya, right, which led to this very, playful midrash in Rashi that Rashi included about, right, there being just one giant frog. But that, like, I think that to render this verse, all these nouns seem like large collective nouns, and I would say something like, vermin or lice kind was amongst humankind and animal kind.
Yeah,
right.
Good. Or lysification, right? Or frogification, right? That sort of is what was happening in that verse. And I think that's a good association. And Rashi, as we're about to read, uses the same French word here that he used in the frogs one plague ago. So let's actually read the Rashi. And it's a very short Rashi, but we've already dealt with most of the material. Alan? God, how much Torah we've not studied because of passing the mics. If you add that up in a year, it's terrifying.
Okay. Vatehi hakinam, and the lice infestation was har chisha. And then the translation here says that the word hakinam means the creeping mass of lice, and it's poudier beloazit, pedulier in Old French.
Right. So basically, Rashi says, reader, you wonder what hakinam means? He turns it into a Hebrew word that refers again to the phenomenon of the lice, not the actual bugs. He says, the word hakinam means richisha, a swarming, a creeping mass of them, as the word pedolire in Old French. We looked at that when Rashi was talking about the frog. Let me share this with you in the Otsar Lo Ze Rashi. Come on, computer. Which word? Rechisha. Swarming, creeping.
No. I'm going to object. There's a huge difference between.
Wait, microphone. If you're object, everyone hear you.
No, Rechisha is clearly swarming.
Right.
And that's also, I think, even the modern term of swarming. So gnats and lice and mosquitoes, they swarm, right? Things that creep are on the ground. This was a phenomenon that was in the air.
Yeah. I was thinking a swarming of creepy crawlies, but I think the word creep must have been in whatever book that Alan was reading.
Right,
from.
that's why I was asking where it came from, because I think that's just wrong.
Right. Look at the screen for a second, and then I see Rachel's hand, and Sue's hand, Rachel's hand, Barry's hand. So here we are, chapter 8 of Shemot, verse 13. Again, we have this word pedoliel, which apparently in Old French, is kfutzat kinim, a swarm of lice, right? And Rashi brought that to us earlier, right? That's entry 3078, and entry 3075 was the same thing, because Rashi brings up our verse as he's talking about, as Stevie said, the odd structure of Vatal Hatzfardeya, the frog arose. Right, one way is reading it is there was one giant frog. The other one was the frogging. Right, the grand swarming of frogs arose. Okay, okay. Sue, Rachel, Barry.
Well, I'm sure I'm not the only one who thinks kalmata sounds like calamity a lot, and so
also an olive.
Also an olive. Okay, and it says under calamity. Google says.
Oh, the etymology of the word calamity?
Yes.
Yeah.
Latin and Old French.
So not helpful.
Well, not helpful in terms of, but unless we think that maybe that didn't go far enough,
right.
I mean, Google doesn't know it all. So it might be part of it.
Rachel and then Barry.
Okay. The biology perspective, I don't know how accurate the connection between kinam or kinim, the insect, and our modern label for the particular species of insect that is lice. Lice jump, they do not fly. That's why there's all this concern when one kid in a classroom gets lice in their hair, that it's going to be next. It's since the lice jump, it's going to be then Norm, then Joel, then Larry, very linear. Okay, but the point I'm making is, if we're talking about the modern insect that we call lice, they don't swarm the way bees swarm, and they don't swarm the way mosquitoes swarm. They will colonize one person or one animal that has hair, because their preferred environment is mammal hair, and then they'll jump to others.
Thank you for that, Rachel. While we're exploring calamity,
maybe that's why some translations have as gnats as opposed to lice, because gnats, in fact, do swarm.
Interesting. Calamitas in Latin originally meant several things, including maybe blight or crop failure, right? Or loss or damage. So maybe we know more than Google does about where the word calamity comes from. Good. Barry.
by now this is a little bit redundant, and Rachel, that's very illuminating. It's kind of direction I was going. A swarm is not a random movement of billions and millions of things. It's not random. It's an organized flow. You wonder whether there's a leader and they all follow the leader, or whether there's some shared intelligence. It goes right, it all goes right. It goes left, it all goes left. It's an intelligent kind of a movement. So yeah, it's not independent hopping things, right. But it's an intelligent movement. And,
like the murmurations of those what are those birds that murmurate? Swallows? No.
So in this case, when the lice are coming, there's like a creation of intelligent movements throughout the land.
Yeah, and let's also remember that our playfulness with what words mean now may or may not be what was intended with the medieval Hebrew word rechisha or the biblical word hakinam. It might just have meant lots of lice, right? Like we hear the English word swarm, and we cannot not think of what we know from science as what swarm means versus other synonyms. But rechisha might just have meant lots of lice. Barbara, and then we'll read the next verse.
Well, I agree with Rachel that they jump, but the wording in the Torah is that all the dust of the earth changed to lice or to vermin, whichever. And so dust gets kicked up as you walk. So it's possible that the dust could have been kicked up by, in the old days you had horses, you had wagons, you had people tramping in dust, and it was dust, and it kicks up into the air.
So every time you would do so, like another rechisha, a mini rechisha of lice would just appear. Good. Joanna?
Exactly.
It fascinates me the times when the Torah moves at such a rapid pace that we, crave more information, and the times when the Torah seems to be, being overly deliberate, overly repetitive. This is one of those times we often have it. Is it not enough to say vaya asuchem? Like we know what the instruction was. So vaya asuchem, they did it. And then, going further into the verse, once we read kol afar haaretz hayachinim, two things about that. One, do we then need the bechol eretz mitzrayim, like the whole land? Did we think it was other lands too? Like, do we need to specify here? And the phrase seems misplaced. Wouldn't that happen before the people are infested, right? Like, doesn't the whole land need to be swarming with these lice? And then the people, and then it, bubbles up to the people and infests them. So I don't know. There's a lot of perplexing things to me about the phrasing of this verse.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. We've been focusing on the one word hakinam and not the larger structure of the verse. I even think there's a missing preposition in the second half of the verse. Kol afar haaretz hayakinim, right? Like if it was hayat lichinim, it would have been that all of the dust of the earth became lice. But it's almost hard to say in English. All of the dust of the earth was lice. Well, what does it mean that it was? That it became, it turned into, was experienced as, and it's all a certain redundancy after we have vatihi hakinam. If hakinam means an overwhelming swarm of lice, then obviously everywhere you looked where there had been dust, there is now lice. So we're focusing on hakinam, but the whole verse itself is structured in an interesting way that says darsheni. Yeah. Larry.
Yeah, I was struck by what Johanna said, because I'm reading two different translations, and they talk about haaretz as if it's the earth, meaning the entire world, but it's clearly not. So, but it was used haaretz and not adamah, not just from the ground. But I thought that the limitation of kol eretz Mitzrayim meant that this only took place in Mitzrayim, and perhaps didn't even take place in Goshen.
Yeah.
So it would exclude that.
It is interesting to wonder what the phrase kol hafar haaretz means in context. It clearly doesn't mean all of the dirt on the planet, right? The Torah doesn't really have even a concept of planet, right? It has a concept of right here. So it's almost as if like the dust of the earth means the ground, right?
And so I take this figuratively, which is, and not literally, but it was as if all the dust had turned into these swarming things, whatever they are. Reminding, as I mentioned, Joel, and you'll remember, the famous baseball games, I think there have been more than one, where the gnats invaded.
The midges.
Were they midges?
Yeah.
One was in Cleveland, I know.
Jabba Chamberlain's career. You're going to upset me and Ilan. We're going to be in a bad mood for 2 days. We knew exactly what game we were doing. I remember where I was sitting in my house during the game, yelling at the umpires to stop the game. Stupid Cleveland. Okay, sorry. What were you saying?
Just as I recall, it was Cleveland. Do you remember exactly who was playing?
I remember what inning it was. Okay. Let's read Stevie.
I think a lot of those plagues have the notion that you can't get away from them, right? That like the water turning the blood, it like lists all the locations, and the frogs, it lists all the locations. I think that's what it's getting at, that there was like the first experience of the plague is that the kinam adam ba'ima, like there's lice on the people and on the things. And then it's also kolafar aretz is like the, like another level of experience that like everywhere you go, you're not getting away from it.
Nice. A local comprehensiveness, right? Good. The first part of the verse is people experience lice, and the second half, there was no place where there wasn't lice. Great. I like that resolution. Okay. Verse 14. This is a pattern we're used to. God tells Moses or Aaron to do something rotten to the Egyptians, and the brilliant Chartumim say, hey, let's see if we can do that too. Right? Well, let's see if we can attempt to. Whom have we not heard from? A lot of people have spoken today. Rebecca, you want to read verse 14? Rebecca's been doing camera work.
Vaya'asu chen hachartumim belatehem lahotzi et hakinim velo yacholu vatihi hakinam ba'adam uva behema.
The key word that's going to be important for the translation is not a complicated Hebrew word. It's just a complicated Hebrew word to figure out what it means here, and that's the word lehotzi. Okay? That's what just going to kind of lead the witness a little bit. Go ahead.
Okay. And thus did the magicians with their secret arts,
right, to
bring forth the lice.
You said bring forth. Tell me why you said bring forth. That's fascinating.
Because that's the suggested translation in my book.
Right. Good. So hamotzi lecha means to like draw something out. Lahotzi can also mean to get rid of, to remove. Right. So it's written in such a way that we want to say, well, of course, what the first thing that the Chartumim would have tried to do would be to get rid of them. But we have a sense of lahotzi is to actually bring into creation, right? That's what the bracha hamotzi means. So Rashi will deal with that, but I want to point it out that it's an ambiguous, at least potentially ambiguous, how to render lahotzi. Go ahead, velo yacholu.
And they could not.
Okay.
And the lice were on man and on beast.
Now, since the verse ends with something like, therefore the lice were, I'll add, still on man and beast, it makes you think that the attempt early in the verse was what? To get rid of, right? Right? They tried to, they tried to get rid of them. They couldn't. That's why they're still there. But if they tried to get rid of them, then the vaya'asuchein is hard to understand, because the vaya'asuchein says they tried to do the same thing. So we've got like 180-degree turns several times in the verse. They tried to do the same thing. That suggests that they were trying to bring more of them. Lahotzi dakinim, to remove them, must be that. But they weren't able to. So if they weren't able to remove them, it must mean that they were still there. It's hard to know how to put all those things together. Larry, you're chomping at the bit.
Yeah, because I want to think about this pattern of Moses and Aaron do something magical, and then the soothsayers, the wizards, whatever they were, do they do the same thing? I mean, I can see it if it was like a magic, show off, and David Copperfield gets up there and makes the plane disappear, and then Adam Kligfeld gets up there and he makes a bit different plane disappear. But if David Copperfield goes out there and he puts a bullet through somebody's head that you don't want to die, then your magicians don't do the same thing.
Right.
So why were the Egyptian magicians at all trying to imitate pulling the rabbit out of the hat? They all along should have been trying to reverse it.
Right. We discussed this already several times, and it's worth returning to. It's almost as if the Torah is presenting Pharaoh and his court not only as powerless but dumb, right? And trying to flex their muscles in a way that would actually exacerbate the problem upon them, right? We will not get to it this week, but later on, probably next week, we'll get to a Rashi that helps us understand that there are streams in the rabbinic tradition that read into the biblical tradition the idea that their magicians, courtiers, are not as powerful as God, but they had some power. They could do some amazing things. It was limited. And it's interesting, in a text that's really a revolution against idolatry and the notion that there's any other God but ours, there are hints that suggest, well, maybe they did have some supernatural power. Not as many as gods, not as much as gods, but they did it almost like foolishly, but they had some power to do things that seemed to be only things that gods could do. A lot of hands. Rick, we haven't heard from you yet today, so start with Rick, Barbara, Joanna, Sue, Norm, and then class will be over. Rick.
Hi. I just since at one point you had pulled out and you looked at the structure of all the verses, the Vatahi Hakinam, it's got the same trope in 13 as in 14, and then the Ba'adam Uva Behema is kind of the same structure. But I'm looking at the story, and the lice don't go away, and I never noticed that before. So I needed to say that they don't go away, which is really weird. Verse 16, you go right into the next, the Arov.
Right.
So what happens to the kinim?
Right.
I thought I had to bring it up. Sorry.
The frogs didn't disappear either. They just got heaped up and became smelly, right? So
but then eventually they got rid of the frogs. They moved the heaps, but here there's nothing.
Yeah, well, it doesn't say that they move the heaps. We just can assume it, right? So some of these plagues like end and disappear, and some of them, it's just we're on to the next plague. I don't even remember if that was dealt with at all in either of the two major 10 plagues movies. Do we see the stoppage of the plague or just the next scene where the next plague begins? I'm not sure. Barbara, Joanna, Sue.
What's the root on Vatahi? What's the 3-letter root?
Haya. It's the verb to be. So it's a complicated structure. It's Vatahi. It's a vav hayipuch, so it looks like a future tense verb, but it's actually a past tense verb, and it just means and it was. And Joanna.
So an example from my teaching life, and then I'll connect it to this passage. As a teacher who uses a whiteboard, every once in a while, you have a bunch of markers on your desk and you grab the wrong one. You should use a dry erase marker on a whiteboard. And every once in a while, I grab a Sharpie, and then you can't erase the Sharpie, except if you know a trick. Go over the Sharpie with dry erase marker, and now you'll be able to erase both the dry erase and the Sharpie.
Really?
So to the point of that these magicians had some, but not all power as God did. They kind of knew that they couldn't get rid of God's lice, but they thought that maybe if on their own they brought about a similar creature and then got rid of it, they could kind of confound the whole thing and get rid of everything.
Very nice. They're sort of somewhat powerful and hapless and pitiful at the same time, right? Sue.
Well, I was just thinking that maybe that's the whole point, that God's power is God's power, and that the Hartumim power is nonsensical.
Yeah.
And that might be it. That's why God is God, and the Hartumim are kind of bumbling idiots.
Right.
It's not. Anyway.
They're empowered, but they're befuddled. Yeah. Were there more hands? Norm, then Steve.
I'm going to rise in defense of the Hartumim.
Okay, defend them more into the mic.
The rabbis later teach us that we are not supposed to pay attention and go to sorcerers and magicians, even if what they do works.
Right.
And the implication is that there are people who can do things that we don't understand. We might call them physicians in some cases. We might call them illusionists in some cases. I often enjoy magic shows, sometimes can sort of figure out what's going on in a trick and sometimes can't. But the point is, even if they have some powers, we're not supposed to go to them. Even if these magicians had real powers, obviously they won't compare with the Holy One, but we're not supposed to rely on them regardless. But the fact that we're not supposed to rely on them, even if what they do works, implies that sometimes what they do works.
Yeah, good, Norm. Stevie? Exactly.
Just to add to what Rick said, my high school teacher thought, I didn't check the verses yet, but that lice doesn't end and boils doesn't end, and that he interpreted darkness as, because it says they couldn't move for 3 days, as like they couldn't even scratch themselves while they were still suffering from boils and from lice. So if you want to embellish these stories, there's some food for thought.
Rosemary.
In defense of the magicians, I think if we know that Moses was in the court, Egyptian, he had learned to do probably from magicians certain things. So I think they were in conflict. They don't know God. So sometimes they think maybe Moses is doing it. It's his knowledge. They had to try their own knowledge to reverse Moses till they come to learn really there was a God.
That's a great comment, which will be even more powerful as soon as we get to verse 15. So remember what Rosemary said. We get there next week. Just read who is reading for Rebecca. Read one word of Rashi, and we'll come back next week. We've been discussing what does the lahotzi mean. Did it mean to remove them, or did it mean to actually bring them about? He says lahotziat hakini means
Livrotam.
Livrotam. What's the root of livrotam?
Bara,
to create, right? So Rashi's making it very clear that even though the end of the verse is going to end with they weren't able to, and still there were lice, which suggests that the thing they were trying to do was to remove them. Rashi says no. Lahotzi means to livro. They were trying in their own weird way to create. We'll get to that next week. In their own way, they were intended to try to create more, and they couldn't. And then somehow the status at the end of the verse is therefore there were the same amount of lice there had been before. No new courtier created lice. Lovely to be studying with you in the Sukkah. See you next week. Moadim l'simcha, to which the response is
Muzmanim b'sason.
Chaguzel. Bye, everybody.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.